formal introduction, and then we'll begin this webinar. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Ger Downs of the Doctoral College here at the University of Limerick. You're all very welcome to today's webinar. Today's session is entitled Writing Your Literature Review. And in doing so, we're going to look at what is a literature review, what's the purpose of that review itself, why the literature review is so important. We're just going to look at the important steps involved in a literature review, ways that you might structure your literature review, analysing the literature, summary and synthesis, comparison and critique, and when to stop. Sometimes that's a very difficult thing to know when to do or what you should do in order to stop writing your literature review. But just about a literature review itself, so we could say about a literature review that it's a summary of the research that has been done on a topic. So, but what is really important with a literature review and what distinguishes a literature review from a what might be in what might consist of a list of sources is that it's a critical evaluation of the sources of the materials that you are looking at. So it's not merely that you are listing that you have read, or stating that you have read a particular source. It's evaluating that source critically and analytically. So to see, where there may be a gap in the literature, because what you have to do when you're doing a literature review is to show that there is a gap in the literature and you're going to address that gap, and that your research is going to, try and not just identify, but to hopefully bridge that gap, but it's what you're going to try and address. So that will mean that in your literature review, you identify a gap, you might identify, for example, inconsistencies, and you might say, well, this is an area for further study. So that's why a literature review is so critical to your PhD, because it's going to set, it's effectively going to provide you with your research question. It's going to determine where your research goes. So it's going to, so by looking at the literature, that is really going to then determine, so much else when it comes to your thesis itself. Okay, so the purpose, what we could say about the purpose of the literature review. We could say here, there are three kind of particular purposes here of the literature review. One is about context, so contextualization. The other is about identification of gaps, and the other is just as something that we could call a foundation for your research. So what do we mean by those? Well, contextualization means that it places your research within the context of existing literature. So it lets you see where your research is with regard to the other literature. And this is just very important for you as a researcher, because it helps you to identify, where there are gaps or where there may be inconsistencies within the existing literature itself. And also, it helps you in terms of your identity as a researcher. One of the things that is always said by examiners when it comes to a PhD is that the PhD candidate didn't have their own voice. There weren't a strong, they weren't a strong, confident, independent researcher. But by doing your literature review, you can see, yes, there's a gap here, and this is where my research lies, and I'm going to address this gap. So it really provides you with a great platform to enhance your own identity as a researcher, and just to enhance your own confidence in terms of undertaking the research. Because we find again and again that, quite a significant number of PhD candidates find that their confidence is undermined because of, the research process is just so onerous, so difficult at times. But if you can place your own research within the existing literature, within the context of the existing literature, that is a great boost to, to your academic self-confidence and to your self-esteem. And obviously, the literature review, when you do conduct that great study of the literature, it is going to identify areas or highlight areas that you haven't, that haven't yet been explored, or that might require, for example, further investigation. And it also provides with what may call the theoretical framework and supports the methodology of your research. Now, theoretical framework we're going to look at in the coming weeks, and the importance of a theoretical framework. But that is just so fundamental to so many people's research. It's just having a theoretical framework, but the theoretical framework, if you like, evolves from the literature review. So it's not as if you start off with a theoretical framework without having examined the literature first. And as well as that, the literature review, it will support the methodology that you use throughout your research. So again, we can see, well, why is a literature review just so fundamental? Why is it so important? First of all, it'll show the examiners, and it shows your supervisors and any readers of your work that you understand, that you're aware of the breadth and depth of knowledge of your field. So that is crucial, because that is something the examiners will really want to see, that you have mastered the literature, that you are very, very familiar with the literature as it relates to your own area of research. The literature review also explains to your readers why your research is so important, but also it shows how you can make a contribution to the field. Because, if we were to say what is a PhD, we could say, well, a PhD is an original contribution to the field, but you won't know that it's an original contribution unless you have read the literature in the area, because you might think you're making an original contribution to the field, but unless you've read the literature, somebody might have got there before you. So it's really necessary, and this is something to, tease out with your supervisor when you go through those supervisory meetings, and when you submit your literature review to your supervisors, just make sure that you've covered all the bases when it comes to literature in your area, because that will show, it's so important to show you've mastered the literature, but it will show, that you've identified a gap, you're going to try and address that gap, and it will show, a literature review is again so important because it will show how you're going to contribute to the field. Because, as I said, the literature review, it'll give you your theoretical framework, it'll support your methodology, but it will also provide you with your, if you like, with your, in finalizing your research questions. And also, just in why, again, just to reiterate that point about why it's so important, your literature review, it avoids any kind of duplication. It ensures that your research is original and that you're not repeating the work that somebody else has done. Okay, so I would say if you're undertaking a literature review, and if I were, say, advising a group of PhD candidates, regardless of discipline, and obviously, this is going to differ from discipline to discipline. And again, this is why I would always say, before undertaking any action, please discuss it first of all with your supervisor or supervisory team, because they will be the people to guide you along the way when it comes to doing the literature review. And your discipline may have different specifications to what, I'm going to say here. So first of all, I would say that an important step in any literature review, a fundamental step, is to define your research question. Now, your research question is something, or research questions, defining your research question and finalizing a research question is such an iterative process. It can go through so many iterations of what it is, of say, so many different stages of refining and honing and changing up your research question. It's very unusual for someone to come into a PhD with a research question and then for that to be the final research question that they are going to deal with. Your literature review, what's always good to do before you start your literature review is obviously to have a research question, to have, we might call it, your first a working research question, we might call it, because that will help you then to define the parameters of what you're looking at in terms of the literature. Otherwise, if you don't have a research question, when you begin a literature review, you could end up reading everything in the area, and that would be really detrimental to you in terms of, trying to write your thesis, because you can find, sometimes we can find in doing a PhD that you can start reading everything about the topic, but it's so important that you write, as quickly as possible after you begin your doctoral studies. So define, I would say, before you begin your literature review, try to define your research question. So state what you are investigating. As I said, your research question can change and can alter, quite significantly, by the time you get to the end of your literature review, because you could start off with one research question, then find in the course of your literature review that somebody has done something similar to you, or you might find that what you thought would be a challenging research question is actually quite rudimentary and quite basic. So you have to look at something that is going to make it, or what I mean by that is that you may find that your research question is not going to help you make an original contribution to the field. So you may have to alter it. So, but I would say before beginning the literature review, have a research question, define what that is, state what it is that you're investigating. And again, as I said, a research question can change, it can mutate and evolve as you go along. But it's so important to have a research question at the beginning of your literature review. Okay, so then I would say the next important point is just to search for relevant literature. So to use, the sources that are available to you, and, you now have a whole multiplicity of sources that you at your fingertips, almost literally at your fingertips. But that in itself creates its own problems, because with such a multiplicity of sources, it can be very difficult to know which literature to use. And again, this is why it's so important to discuss this with your supervisors and your supervisory team about how you go about searching for the literature to ensure that you're not reading everything continually. Okay. I would say then that it's really important then to evaluate the sources, just to, as I said at the start, you must critically analyze the sources and critically assess the merit and worth of each of those sources, rather than just say, well, I read something by a particular author, and then I read something by another author. It's an assessment of the work that they have conducted. Okay, so then I would say you need to organize the literature, and you need to group your studies by various themes, or you may decide, for example, to do so by methodologies or other criteria. So you might decide, for example, to group the literature in terms of chronologically and when the literature was first published, or you might decide to do it by themes, or by in terms of the methodology used, or some other criteria, apart from thematically, chronologically, methodologically, and there may be other criteria that you could use to organize your literature. So that's why, it's really good. I think not everybody does this, but I think it's really good practice to try and group your studies by into one of these categories, because that can just help you to keep track of the literature, and it makes sure that you're not dealing with an overwhelming amount of information. And again, then I would say the next step in any literature review is to write it, to synthesize the information, to highlight the key findings and the gaps. So when we talk about synthesizing the information, this means that you're combining insights from different studies. So when we say synthesizing information in a literature review, you're combining, as I said, insights from various studies and the purpose of that is to create a cohesive and extensive understanding of the topic. So again, that's, there is a method to all of these things. They're not just, so when I say, that synthesize the information, it's just combining them into a cohesive and a coherent whole. Okay, and then it says to synthesize the information, highlighting key findings and gaps. So the kind of gaps that you may find, again, depends from discipline to discipline, but there's all kinds of different kind of gaps that you can find. And the gap is what, you're going to address to show that you're making an original contribution to knowledge. So it could be, for example, it could be a theoretical gap in the knowledge. It could be a temporal, could be a time thing, that nothing has been done on this for quite a significant amount of time. It could be that there's a gap. It could be a literature gap. So you can just see that there's a gap there in the literature that you're going to address. It could be a conceptual gap. It could be a methodological gap, or it could be, say, for example, an empirical gap. So it's always good just to say, and to look at and to think of what kind of gap is that. It's not always necessary to look at it, in that way, but I think it would help you to, when you're speaking about the gap that you're trying to address, what kind of a gap is it? Is it a theoretical gap? Is it a gap in the, is it a gap in the literature? Is it, for example, a methodological gap? So I think all of those things are really good to kind of be aware of, because again, it just helps you to build your confidence as a researcher, because it's very important that you create a strong identity for yourself as a researcher, because so many people who do a PhD are perfectionists. They suffer from what we call imposter syndrome and feel like they shouldn't be involved in doing something like a PhD, because they think, oh, I'll get found out, or this is beyond me. So many people feel that way, and in so many cases it is utterly unjustified that people feel like an imposter, or that this is beyond them. The greatest characteristic, I think, of PhD candidates, I would say, is persistence, to overcome disappointment and resilience, and be able to bounce back from setbacks, which you will have along the way. And the literature review is one of those areas where you're likely to have some kind of setback, because you're trying to collate and synthesize into a single narrative a huge amount of studies, and you're trying to critically analyze those, and you're trying to do so much within the literature review. As I say, you're trying to identify a gap, you're trying to look at a way in which you can address that gap, you're looking at where your research lies in the field. You're then going to look at, you're going to use this literature review to develop your theoretical framework and to help, justify your methodology. So the literature review does a lot for your PhD. Okay, just ways, I just talk about ways in which you might, structure your literature review. And here we're just going to look at 4 ways for the moment. There are others, but I think these are the most common, or the most, I would say, just the most used by people such as yourselves, by doctoral candidates. So we would say there's chronological, there's thematic, methodological, and theoretical. So let's just look at each of those. So by chronological, this is where you organize the data by the date of publication. And it isn't merely, that you're doing this in chronological order just to show, that the first instance of of literature in this area was in 1975, for example, and now all the way up to 2025, you can see that the literature has, has become more sophisticated within that time. That's not really what it's about. The purpose of organizing your data in a chronological manner is to show the development of the research over time. So it's quite likely in whichever field you're in that the research itself into your area will have developed and evolved and changed over time. So that's why I would say it's not suitable for all, but chronological, looking at your literature review in a chronological manner can be suitable for some people. The next one to look at is thematic. So this is where you structure or you group the literature into various themes or various topics. And so it means that this can be particularly useful to you, if you want to categorize, the kinds of studies that have been done. So, and again, it can just help you because a literature review tends to be quite an unwieldy and large document. So this can be very, very helpful to look at something by the theme or by the topic, by looking at the literature in the area, according to those particular themes or topics. The next one, another way in which you might structure your literature review, is methodological. So that's organizing it by the methods that have been used in the study. And we'll see in one of the webinars coming up on, your methodology, a lot of that can be dependent on the kind of approach or research design that you put in place. But analyzing the literature, critically evaluating the literature in this way, can be particularly suitable for those who are, for example, maybe what you have done is when you're conducting your literature review, you have, identified a methodological gap in the literature. And so, for example, if that is the kind of study that you're undertaking, it can be very useful to organize, your literature review methodologically. The next one that I have here is theoretical. So you could say, and again, I should state, not everybody chooses to structure their literature review in one of these ways. There may be other ways that you do it. And again, this is why it's so important, as I say, to speak to your supervisor and supervisory team, because they're the first people who'll be able to guide you in this in how to actually go about structuring your literature review. So in some cases, it may be that you group the literature by various theories or models that have been discussed in the literature, and that's another way in which you can actually structure it. Again, that can be very, very useful in terms of helping you to bring together a lot of complex information into a much more cogent and coherent narrative. Okay, so
sorry, can I ask
sure.
you things?
Yes.
So
yeah.
Is it possible, like, to mix like different methods for the literature review, like, I don't know, like chronological with methodological or thematic with theoretical?
Yes, absolutely. Because and that's a great question, because it may well be the case, that when I talked earlier about the gap, say, when you're highlighting key findings and gaps, that some of those gaps could be methodological, they could be temporal, could be a literature gap, an empirical gap, methodological gap. So at that, it could be the case that you have, you found various elements of each, and therefore, there's nothing to stop you when it comes to structuring your literature review to doing so to using different categories for structuring your literature review. It doesn't mean you have to do structures in one particular way. And some people choose not to use any kind of overall or overarching way or theme to structure their literature review. So so I talked earlier. I talked about these various ways in which you could do that, but it could be the way that people use all of these, or they could use, these with other ways as well to structure their literature review. Again, I would just say it's so important that you speak first of all to your supervisor and supervisory team, because what could happen is that you might decide, okay, I'm going to structure my literature review this way, but it's so important to speak to your supervisor beforehand, because they will be able to address, say, any kind of potential pitfalls, any obstacles that you might have, or things that might be, difficult for you to see now. If you decide, okay, I'm going to try and do I'm going to try and structure my literature review in a chronological format to show the evolution of the research, but there may not be, many publications in your area to show how or you may not be able to show how the research has evolved, or it may not have evolved that much over time. So it's always really important to speak to your supervisor beforehand.
Okay,
But that's a great question. Really
thank you
great
so much.
question.
Thank
yeah,
you.
no problem. Thank you for the question. That's great. So just to continue on, so just to talk about the kinds of analysis that you could do. And again, I would say here, and again, some people go through a PhD without ever necessarily thinking about kinds of analysis that you could do of a literature review. But I would say there's three C's, if you like, involved in this. So first of all, I would say there's critical analysis, and I'll bring these up in a moment, where you're looking at the strengths, maybe the weaknesses of a particular study. So critical analysis. So that's a real, you're really evaluating the literature on its merits. The other one, so critical analysis, then you would have comparative analysis, and comparative analysis would be where you would, for example, compare and contrast, different studies in which you're trying to identify different trends or different patterns in the literature. And the next one, and again, I'll bring these up in a moment, is about context, or what we might call contextual analysis. So that's where you're looking at the context in which the research was undertaken and what its relevance is to your study. So let's look at those one by one. So first of all, critical analysis. So again, evaluating the strengths and the weaknesses, of each study. And again, that is absolutely essential to any literature review, because, as I said, it's not just a shopping list of all the literature in the area. I confess, when I began my literature review many, many years ago, I thought, I said, and I wasn't sure what a literature review was. And you couldn't Google at the time, which shows you how far back that was when I did my PhD or started my PhD. But the thing was that I assumed when I started my literature review that I would just list all the literature in the area and say, this is done, this was written by certain person, this article was written by somebody else, and we see, and it discusses a particular area, a particular topic. But of course, I then realized when I gave this to my supervisor that I had misunderstood what a literature review was about. So then I had to go back, and I was told, no, you have to analyze the literature. You really have to look at, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of each study. So when you are, and it's not merely a case of saying, you don't put in everything that you've read, it's of what's of relevance to your study. And then, so you assess, okay, you look at what's relevant to your study, then you assess it, you analyze it, then you write about your analysis, but it's always of relevance to your literature, but this is going to help you just to identify the gap that you are going to address in your literature review. And that gap, by addressing that gap, that is going to be your original contribution to knowledge. So it's absolutely fundamental. And I confess, when I began my PhD, I didn't see the literature review. I didn't understand at the beginning of my PhD that the literature review was so important. As I said, I thought it was just a way of looking at what literature was there, and that would help me then to do my own study without realizing, okay, actually, if I do a critical analysis, that can help me to see, what studies have been done, what I can do, because now I can see, okay, all these studies have been done in this particular area. So I can see, okay, there's a gap there for my work. So I was able to identify that gap. I tried then in my own PhD to address that gap. But, and after that, then that was going to be my original contribution. Sorry, Norma, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Jared.
Hi, how are
I
you?
suppose this is the question possibly that everybody has, and you probably can't answer, but how do you know you've read enough?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a great question. Yeah. It's a fantastic question because, yeah, it can be really hard, Norma, particularly because you have so many sources. Again, I would say it's so important that you discuss that with your supervisor and your supervisory team. You should be able to gauge a good amount from the literature that's there. Sometimes it's not even possible to look at everything. Sometimes you have to. I would say I'm just going to give you some tips later on for various studies that are out in the field, and just for various platforms that you could use to look at what literature is there, or the expanse, just to look at what oh, sorry, would you be able to turn off your mic? Yeah, thank you. Just to look at, say, Norma, what the breadth of literature that's there. And I'll give you some of those. I'll just show you those in a few minutes. But again,
Super,
I'd say, yeah, just discuss that with your supervisory team. But it's a brilliant question because, nowadays, literally at your fingertips, you have this access to, it could be just thousands and thousands.
Well, it's just every paper you read, and the
Yeah.
reference, there's 40, 50 referrances at the end of every single paper.
Yeah,
You're kind of wondering, should I be reading all of those as well?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips shortly, just to how to go about kind of dealing with, or how to maybe just crunch up a lot of those. There's also some brilliant AI tools as well, but I just want to show you one that is called Connected Papers, which I think is just fabulous for helping people to, synthesize a lot of the literature, without writing the literature review for you, because that's not something that should ever be done. But it just really, really helps you to see the breadth of literature that's there and what's of relevance to your study. So
Super,
I'll do that. Yeah, just in a minute or two, Norma. Yeah, that would be great. But it's such an important question. It's hard to underestimate how good a question that is, because it really it's the within that question, Norma, there is so much, because when I say, for example, and I don't mean to sound like, as in when I did my PhD, oh, it was so tough. When I started my PhD, I could now look back and almost envy myself because of the fact that the amount of literature in the area was so small in compared to what it is now. The sources that I had to get were not, available online. So I had to get them through, say, the interlibrary loan system here in the library. I went and visited other libraries where I was able to get access to sources, but it meant that, there was a relatively small body of literature there at the time on my particular area. And it was, looking back at it, I didn't think so at the time, but looking back at it was relatively easy to identify a gap in the literature and to say, okay, this is where my literature lies. But nowadays, I really don't envy somebody starting a PhD when you're looking at the literature, because, as you say, Norma, you look at one paper and there's like so many references afterwards, and you think, oh my God, I could use this, I could use this particular topic. But that is why I think it's just so important to have a good research question at the start of your before you begin your literature review, because that's going to determine, the length or the breadth of sources that you're going to look at. But I think as well, you have to make, I shouldn't necessarily say you have to make use of particular tools, but I think a platform like Connected Papers can be really good. But I'll get to that just in a couple of minutes. As I said, comparative analysis, where you're looking at different studies to identify maybe some kinds of particular trends or patterns. You're comparing and contrasting those. And the next one was contextual, wasn't it? Contextual analysis, where you're looking at the context in which the research was conducted and what its relevance is to your study. So just a couple more things here before I get on to showing you Connected Papers. The next one we're looking at is called summary and synthesis. And as I say, when you're trying to bring your literature review together, so what you're trying to do is to summarize, all the key findings and to combine those insights into a single coherent narrative. So you're, first of all, I would say summarize your key findings, provide an overview of the main findings from the literature. Again, always speak to your supervisory team about this. Synthesize, as I said, synthesizing information, bringing everything together. So if I was to say to people, okay, how would you, how would you go about, say, for example, synthesizing information? I would say, you could do it like, say, you would identify common themes in the literature. I'll just give you an example of something that you could do. For example, so okay, I'll give you an example of a study. Say you have a study, and just to show you what I mean by this, say you have a study on something topical like the impact of social media on mental health. So say, for example, or mental health of teenagers, for example. You might find when you're doing a study like this that the studies that you're looking at will talk about things like anxiety, self-esteem, depression. What you can do with these is you can group these studies by various themes, by common themes, to see how they all interrelate to each other. And then what you could do is you could combine and contrast the findings. So you might find in some instances, the results of the analysis will show that social media use increases anxiety, whereas in another group, it might say, well, use of social media has no impact upon the stress levels of those particular groups. So it's always good to look at, what are the patterns, or, what, say, for example, there may be a difference in social media anxiety with regard to age, or the types indeed of the social media platforms that people use. And then what's always good to do is to kind of integrate those different perspectives into so say, for example, one study has looked at this issue in a quantitative manner, and the other has used qualitative methods. So it may be good to integrate the different perspectives, because this will help to provide you with a more in-depth or richer knowledge of the topic. And it's always good to show, over time how, for example, patterns have developed, say, for regard to social media. Because I remember back in, I think it was in 2009, where there was a major revolt in Iran after the presidential elections there, and after the president at the time, I think it was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was deemed to be the winner of the 2009 presidential election in Iran. And the thing was that a lot of the Western newspapers came up with very superficial headlines, like, say, for example, this was the first Facebook revolution or the first Twitter revolution. And similarly, in 2011, at the time of the Arab Spring, when I think the leaders of Tunisia and Egypt were overthrown, that at the time, these uprisings were referred to as, a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution, as if social media had played this huge role in helping to depose or to highlight problems with or political problems and political leadership, and had led to a great deal of political upheaval. Now, I'd argue that the role of social media in those was quite low, much lower than what was stated in Western media sources in particular. But at the same time, if you look at the literature on social media back then, when Facebook began, when Twitter began, the um, analysis of those social media platforms was overwhelmingly positive because, for example, Facebook was seen as, a great way of bringing people together, of helping to, just bring old friends and communities together. And now you could have study groups and communities of practice, and have seen as a great way of combining, various, different groups of people and helping them to, to create connections and forming communities of practice, etc. Similarly with Twitter, Twitter was seen as a godsend for people in academia because you could connect with other, with other researchers. You could see what they were doing. They would, publish their research on Twitter. They would notify people on Twitter that that they had written a new paper. It was always good for creating networks and for new combinations. But nowadays you can see how the patterns have changed with regard to looking at social media. In the analysis of social media that we saw it, you would see probably a pattern where social media was seen as this godsend, this great, gift that was, going to unite people and help to resolve a lot of problems and a lot of misunderstandings, to the point now where social media can be seen as toxic, where it can be seen as very divisive, where it could be seen as, very traumatic, having a terrible impact on people's mental health, in terms of levels of self-esteem, anxiety, and depression. So it's always good to look and see how patterns in terms of a particular phenomenon change over time. So that's why I would say, when you're trying to synthesize information, it's always good to look at different studies, compare different perspectives, highlight the trends and patterns that you see over time, and try to address any gaps and inconsistencies in doing so. So again, just highlight the areas that need further research. So very nearly finished on this now. So I would say, the literature review should be framed by your initial research question. Often the literature review will end with a statement of your updated research question. So the literature must be of relevance to your study. And that's why it's so important that you have a research question when you begin, or, even a draft research question. And it's better to use the work by original authors of materials rather than a review of that same material by other authors. It's always better, I think, to use the original sources. Sometimes that's not possible, but I think it's always better to use the work by original authors of that material, and be selective in a literature review and ask, well, why am I including this? So I would say, okay, I think a lot of that is done already. This is about when to stop. It's knowing, a point comes in the literature, when in literature review, when you have to stop. But I'll send all these slides on to you, but I just want to show you some of these, tools that you could use. So I'll send you on these slides, and they all have links to various tools that you could use. One of those is Connected Papers. Now, I'm not going to click on it here because it'll take us out of the presentation itself, and we might be able to show you that live while we're doing this. But I'll put up a link to Connected Papers also on the YouTube recording. But Connected Papers is a really, really fabulous resource that will help you. For example, you can type in, for example, what your research question is, what your initial research question is, and it will give you so many sources in the area, but it will help to synthesize what are the most relevant papers in the area. And as I said, what you should be doing with a literature review is to look at the most relevant sources. Now, as I say, I don't envy you because you have so many sources available, and what you have to be aware of, which was never the case when I was doing a PhD, you have to be aware of things like what we call predatory journals. And again, if you don't know what predatory journals are, I'd say, discuss with your supervisor. Predatory journals are journals with very little academic credibility, but They are solely for profit journals that have a very lax, if one could say, effectively non-existent peer review system. So they have no credibility whatsoever as a major journal in the field. And it's important to be aware, that there are predatory journals. They tend to be journals that are, if you submit a paper to one of these journals, for example, it's very likely that you'll get a response which tells you that that they will publish your paper without effectively conducting any kind of review, and then what you will find is that you'll be delighted. You'll say, "Wow, that's great! I've got to get a publication from this. How wonderful is that?" And then you will find that you end up being charged. They're going to come after you for a significant amount of money to publish your paper. So you have to be careful about predatory journals. But connected papers can help you in this regard. As far as I'm aware, I think it'll just look for credible academic sources. So you may find, for example, with a lot of AI tools, that they will quote you or cite you non-existent sources or sources that are from predatory journals, as well as from credible academic journals. But there's some good AI tools also. But I'll just put up here, just to conclude, just some of these academic research tools. So connected papers, and I would, I'll try to show you an example later when I send the slides. Elicit is one. There's Insightful. XYZ has said it's always good to be aware of these kinds of journals. There's Litmaps, there's Ryan AI, there's Research Rabbit, and there's Cite AI. So Semantic Scholar also. So, but I would say that the best of these that I've seen so far is connected papers. But sorry, there was a question there from somebody. But actually, what I'm just going to do is to finish this presentation now. So I'm just going to go to the end of the presentation here, and yeah, this is, so just going to say the last thing when you're doing a literature review, just to ask yourself at the end of the literature review, just say, have I supported and justified my research question with the sources that I've used? Have I included sources that don't contribute to my argument? And then you ask, well, what's the purpose of including them? Have you then got the right balance between description and critical analysis or critical writing? Have you not included certain important aspects of the literature or left perhaps unanswered questions? That's something you can ask, and that'll be very obvious to you at the end of your literature review. And then you could say, have you commented on the relevance of each piece of evidence in your review? So just make sure, whether you're describing the literature or critically assessing it, that you have commented on the relevance of each piece of literature in your study. So I would say, final thought, don't get it right, get it written. And I would just say to those who are watching the webinar, on YouTube afterwards, I would just say thank you very much, and see you shortly. And again, just thanks for all your time and patience in watching this webinar. So, thank you very, very much. We can just have a quick discussion with the people who are here online. But for those of you who are watching the webinar later, not watching live, I would say thank you very much for your time, and we'll just stop recording now.